Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 8 of PoddyC. We're joined by two amazing guests who play Dragon, Sang, and Maevey here.
Hello.
What's up, big dog?
And yeah, we have the usual two other guys.
All right. Yes, we do. The point of today's episode is it's been one full not full expansion, I guess, as full as it's gonna be, of new content at least with the new class, and we haven't had a new class in a while, and they have two extremely polarizing specs, I would say, and just that Prez is just a shorter range healer. I think that's just like really different, and then Aug is just the definition of polarizing. And we have guests here today. Both of them raid in Liquid, and they both maybe spent a lot of time playing Prez this expansion, and he was our Augfficer this last raid, and he was preparing. He was the first person in our guild to kind of really go all into Aug when it was announced, because we needed someone to do that. And then he ended up not playing this raid only for the reason that finding someone to do that role outside the raid is significantly harder than finding someone to play in the raid. That was very challenging and time consuming, and also the willingness to do it is something as well. And then Sang has been a dev evoker, pretty much full hard swap main from the beginning of the expansion. Did some pulls on Fyrak on it, but that class was kind of bad, right? And then he's been an Aug for us ever since, after being a Moonkin for a really long time. So we have kind of all the bases covered with Evoker with these two, and we are looking to dive deep into where this class has come from, where it's going, how it went. And, if there's some things maybe they could look at going into next expansion, but just, I guess, the overall experience. So where are we starting up?
I think it makes sense to start with range, because that was like one of the first things we learned about the spec or the class was that it was going to be short range. Then during beta, people complained enough that they made Prez 5 extra yards compared to Dev and Aug. So I guess my question, mostly for Maevey as the Prez guy, I feel like it's still kneecapped by the range in a lot of content, and I feel like this raid tier in particular, you feel the range issue more than like Vault Incarnates, where I think they did a good job of like designing around it more. Have you felt that way about Prez as well? Do you think that's a noticeable weakness of the spec, or is it something that's actually worked out pretty well?
I mean, it's definitely frustrating with certain utility stuff like dispelling and externaling people, especially on fights like Nimue, where you're so spread out, whereas you can just log on any other healer and you can cover the entire raid by standing in the middle, whereas Prez, you're pretty much hard stuck to healing, maybe only 2/3 of the raid. I feel like the range somewhat is offset by the mobility of the class in general. But the fact that like Spatial Paradox exists on Aug but doesn't exist for Prez is a little bit weird as a way of like augmenting the limited range. So there's definitely room for improvement. But also part of it, I think, is everything is so localized in terms of area with their healing. Like you have Dream Breath, which is a cone. You have TA, which is just a straight line orb. You have Emerald Blossom, which is you target someone to throw a flower at their feet, and then it's like healing around them. You don't really have too many tools that are like spread AoE tools outside of Spirit Bloom. So the range is an issue in and of itself, but there's a lot of other complex natures.
Yeah,
to
the
the
cone
abilities.
targeting in like M+, I know, is always either the Evokers are complaining that people are out of their cones or like are dodging them, or people are complaining they're not getting healed, right? As one or the other.
Playing with 2 ranged in Mythic Plus, it's like one person's on one side of you, the other person's on the other side, and you're just in a desperate fight to try and get them to stack up or to play together or something. Or you're trying to find the right angle to cover them both.
Yeah, it's actually so hard to play around Prez too. Like I remember specifically in season 1 when it was considered meta at the time, especially in dungeons like what was that one? The one with the flying,
Not
on
good?
around
Not
playing
good.
one. Yeah, no good.
Yeah.
Yeah. The second boss, that was like
Mm.
a major struggle for preservation. Having to like spread out and do the explosions and then trying to collect the orbs and then like try to like regroup for preservation healing was really difficult.
Also,
Well,
the empowers, like having to sit there and like channel them, like Spirit Bloom, you always want to fully empower. Fire Breath, you typically want to fully empower. Dream Breath, you can kind of get away with not empowering because it does the same healing, but it's just like hot versus an like upfront burst. So I mean, you can kind of get away with like only doing a 1 or a 2, or maybe fully charging it up to 3.
my my issue with the range thing, and I want Sang after this to kind of give his, because he's had multiple raids of trying to be a range DPS but having less range and having to sometimes make some concessions on his positioning because of that. But in the first raid of this expansion, we all know this, they very clearly designed it and the last boss specifically. Not even it, like it was to showcase Evoker. It was like, oh, you guys think this utility doesn't matter? Here, every single thing on this fight requires you to use a couple of these things, right? And then as the expansion has gone on and culminating in the end of this most recent raid, it seems they've gone back. When you have 25-yard healers and DPS in range, you kind of have to design raids knowing that, which is why I thought it was such an interesting choice for them to make. You always have to have that in the back of your mind. It's no longer melee and range. It's like, oh, there's this thing too, right? And they did that in Vault. And then as time went on, there was more and more problems. And the last two bosses of this raid, there's significant challenges, regardless of the extra movement you get from it. There's significant challenges in just being 30 yards away from everyone or 25 yards away from the boss and trying to position accordingly due to that. And I wonder if that's kind of like a mistake going forward. Because like part of us talking about this is like, did this experiment work? Did making a range class, not 40 yards, like, is that something that's going to make sense going forward? If we didn't play one in progression, I think preservation would have actually been a pretty good healer for Fire Axe specifically for just like the HPS required of it, not including the dispel problem. But like the dispels for both the last two bosses would have been a major challenge, I think, for preservation. And from the people I've heard that have played it, it was really annoying. And this is always something they're going to have to. This is going to exist further on. Amirdrassil was closer to the normal raid than Vault was, right? This is what raids are going to look like, and preservation is always just going to have to kind of choose. I guess it's okay if there's a healing profile that, oh, well, you can't actually reach everyone in the raid. Okay, that sounds weird, but like maybe you're the best healer at the people you're in range of, and then you play around that. But then wouldn't you double down and just make sure everyone's always stacked, and then you're just kind of the best healer, and like how do you balance that? It seems like something that's super problematic, and also you guys have talked about this, I think, a few times. I've heard Sang say this. You mentioned Spatial Paradox. I don't understand why that's something that all three specs don't have. Because it's like, even if preservation had it alone, it would just be kind of like rule of law, right? Like a one-time use, like, oh, I'm going to have to be out of range here. Like, I can use this on myself. Why does Devastation not have it? How can Devastation find a spot in the raid if, like, Aug has, like all those other things, but also Spatial Paradox? Like, do you guys think about that?
I definitely have like it is definitely a big thing, like specifically Spatial Paradox too, where there are some fights like that button is like just night and day difference on like certain parts of like Farrakh movements or even like Tindril and just like coverage, and then it being tied to like a specific spec like really locks down like, oh, if you like need to play this specific spec of a class, and then like it's kind of like it has that spec also has like almost all the same utility as like another like Devastation, but it's just better. And it's definitely like a problem, like as to like some of those things like could be more global, that way you have like more flexibility of like bringing the other specializations of the class. And Spatial Paradox definitely is like one that like very criminal for being locked to a specific spec, I think.
Yeah,
What do you think about
Spatial,
that, maybe?
Spatial Paradox is like playing Aug, and you feel like you're out of range of someone, or like you feel like you're teetering on the range of someone. You just press the button, and you're just instantly in range of the entire raid. It feels so nice to just have that window where you go from I'm hopeless trying to find this person, and I need to do something with them, to instantly I'm able to do whatever I need to do, whether it's heal them if you were playing Prez, or if it's buffing them as Aug, or if you're just out of range on like a boss as Dev, like the ability to have like a 2-minute cooldown where like you just have 10 seconds where you're able to ignore the restrictions, it would help, I think, all 3 specs a lot. Not that, obviously Aug is overpowered, so it's not like it really needs more things, but it already has it to begin with. But like the other 2 specs, I feel like they could use a little bit more to kind of bring them in line with like not with Aug, but like with the rest of like the specs in the game that they're competing against.
Yeah, I have a different problem with Spatial Paradox, which is kind of this is like a dev evoker problem, which is just like, how do you ever bring a dev evoker to raid in a world where Augmentation Evoker exists and has tools unique to it, whereas dev doesn't have any tools unique to it, right? Like Aug is bringing the Obsidian Scales, Black Attunement thing. You're bringing Spatial Paradox, right? And you have all of these extra freer globals and still do most of your damage, where you can do stuff like off heal or rescue things or whatever, and be a lot less sad about it. I guess that's a little bit less of a thing, but Spatial Paradox I think is a big example of that, where it's just like, this is filling the same DPS role as the other spec, but it reminds me of like playing an Ellie Shaman versus playing a mage, where it's just like, we're gonna need this spec to do like 15% more damage to make up for the fact that it's just not bringing any of this huge utility suite that Aug brings.
Well, and this will be something we talk about when we we're gonna go, just for people listening, we're gonna go a little bit deeper into Aug later. But this is just kind of the issue with their entire philosophy behind that spec is, oh well, the reason they have all these things and it's the class that like has all these tools is because they're the support class. But really, you just add up how much their support is contributing to DPS, and they really are just a DPS class that just has way, way, way more things than everyone else. And that just simply doesn't make sense. And I think they need to remedy that in the next expansion. I mean, they have a lot of stuff to do with Aug. We'll get into that later. But one thing I think, just to tie up Spatial Paradox, I think Spatial Paradox should just be on the class tree available to all 3 specs. It's way too good, unique, and it helps all 3 specs in a way. I think Aug and Devastation should only be able to put it on a healer, and then they get the benefit. I think healer should get Spatial Paradox, and they can use it on anyone, and they also get it on themselves. So if you choose to bring a preservation, their unique thing is that you can actually put that on a ranged DPS for as many of those as you have in the raid.
Putting on a melee DPS is also really interesting because of the way, like, because Mistweavers and Holy Paladins can get it, it actually increases the range of their melee abilities as well. So like,
interesting. It'd be like that Survival Hunter ability.
Yeah, so you don't get like full 40-yard range. You just get double range. So instead of 5 yards, you get 10 yards or whatever. But like, going from playing melee to playing like Outlaw with long arms or Feral with long arms, there's a world of a difference there. And so like getting 10 seconds of being able to do that, even as like a melee, is really nice. But I mean, like Spatial should be like Innervate. Druids have Innervate on their class tree. Why doesn't Evoker have Spatial?
Yeah, Spatial seems really similar to Innervate in concept, right? So like how, and we went through this, excuse me, we went through this thing for like, what was it, like 6 or 7 years or maybe even longer, where only Moonkins had this. So it was just like, okay, other specs of Druid, you only need a couple of them in your raid. It's probably going to be the ones with that spell, especially in expansions where mana mattered much more. So yeah, definitely think they should work on that. I was saying, how this expansion, are there any bosses that you felt that you playing range DPS, which you played all of Aberrus, you did, I think you did a little bit of Razageth, and you did Aug this raid. So can you name some examples, or like, do you have any concerns with being the range DPS that just can't go as far out as everyone else?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a difference just specifically between Devastation and Augmentation, between 25-yard restriction to other players versus 25-yard restriction to bosses. And I would actually say, like, when you're attacking a boss, 25 yards is actually like pretty, it's lenient. Like you
Huge hitbox, yeah.
Yeah, I think like it is hard to like say, like, there's not that many cases where like a 25-yard range attacking a boss has really been problematic, because I think in most cases, like, most ranges don't stand max 40 yards away unless like you're trying to bait mechanics. So like you're generally like in a like just kind of front line, but like with the rest of the range. I'd say there are some bosses that like especially ones that like jump around a lot, that you'll struggle a little bit. I think like the worst I've had is, I mean, it's an easy boss, but like Forgotten Experiments is probably one of the worst ones that I've had to experience, where
Oh yeah.
you get like slowed, and then the boss is on one side of the room and jumps to the other, and you're just like sitting there just waiting for him to stop flying around, and that's like,
You're basically a melee at that point.
yeah. So again, like there's actually like not that many cases where 25 yards is like a problem. Maybe it's like when it comes to aiming certain abilities, like I said, like fire breath, like you try to hit as many targets, and maybe you have to like line up like a shot with that ability, and then like deep breath too. But the movement the class has also helps a lot with like covering like short inconveniences. Like if you're out of range for like a moment, you could just hover like back in range real quick, or get in a better spot. It gives you like a nice amount of time to like prepare your movement or any
Okay.
possible boss movement.
And I was thinking like Fire Rat kind of, right? Like the reason that you guys in our guild were so late on the seed order was our strat is keep seeds away from all blazes at all times. Evokers actually can't do that because of how close you need to be to the boss kind of thing. So that was like one thing that I felt
Yeah.
was like a little worse. There were some bosses earlier, I forget which bosses they were like you would bait things as range and you tried to bait them far away, and like Evoker was just like couldn't go as far.
Yeah, I think in those particular cases, again with augmentation, since you're like working around 25 yards of other players, it's very restrictive. And when you're just trying to be out in the middle of nowhere doing your own seed, it just does not. It really fundamentally doesn't work, and so it's just very punishing if like you're trying to optimally do anything, but you need to be like 30, 40 yards away from other people just to place a mechanic is very brutal to do that for sure.
Okay, next thing I want to talk about is a little bit less evoker specific and a little bit more Prez specific, which is just, this is one of those specs that it came out at the start of the expansion. It was doing pretty well. It was strong. It took some nerfs, and now it kind of hasn't been heard from ever since. So this is less of like a design of evoker philosophy question, but more of a like, what happened here? How do we fix this? Obviously, the spatial paradox being added to the kit would be something that would make it more compelling for raid. But even for Mythic Plus, this is a spec that went from being good at the start of the expansion to being, I think, the least popular healer spec now out of all 7. Which obviously it's a new spec. Not a lot of people necessarily play it, but a lot of people were excited picking it up and learning it, and now that seems to have stopped. What went wrong, and do you have any? I guess mostly just what went wrong. What went wrong with Prez, maybe?
I mean, so like we touched on range, and I mean, just to like, I believe like the area coverage for Prez is like 56% of like what a normal healer can cover, which is like an issue in and of itself. We touched on that. Outside of that, I mean, they've over nerfed things like temporal anomaly to the point where it's hardly worth taking. They've teetered back and forth on like, oh, let's give you 5 echoes, then let's give you 3. No, let's give you 5 again. Now we're back to 3. So it's like they can't even find a point where like a good balancing point on like what is acceptable, because there's issues with like in raid TA is too strong at applying echo, but in Mythic Plus it's not strong enough when you're needing to cover all 5 people. And so like having echo be tied to something as strong as TA, where you can like stasis it and you're able to cast it very frequently in raids, but then in Mythic Plus, your reliance on it to actually cover damage patterns, it's problematic, and I think they should find a way to get mass applications of echo out of TA and into something like a power word radiance kind of system, where like it's charge based maybe, and you can bank up 2 charges, and that way you can have Mythic Plus where you can bank on those 2 charges and get mass echo applications when you need them. But in raid it's not too powerful where you're on this short cooldown spamming out tons of echoes and covering the entire raid with like a stasis window. On top of that, I mean, right now it's way too reliant on Emerald Blossom healing, and that in and of itself is an issue where like
Oh yeah.
the spec has 2 distinct playstyles. It's Echo healing or Emerald Blossom, and like Emerald Blossom is just all stacked, grouped, nonstop. You're going from 0 health to full health every global kind of thing, where you're overhealing way too much, and you have no like. There's no nuance in like how much healing you're doing. You're not like healing someone for just enough. You're always healing them for the entire health bar, or you're not healing them at all. And so it's weird to play around that in like a group wide healing comp, but you can play around that in Mythic Plus where you're the only healer. So I think in Mythic Plus it's still thriving. Obviously, it has less utility than a lot of other healers, and it does a little bit less damage, and it's a little less survivable. So it's hard to see it in like high keys, but I think it's fine in terms of a healing pattern for Mythic Plus.
Okay.
Outside of that, I mean, as I touched on before, like the conal issues of Dream Breath and TA can have weird restrictions in raid, where you're dealing with spread out groups and things like that.
Cool.
Yeah, I will say. I mean, I feel like preservation is definitely underrated and it's very underplayed. But I think it's partially due to the fact that people are just not interested in playing a preservation when they could be instead playing something that's more traditional.
Yeah,
I've
well,
noticed Evoker as a whole is just a lot less popular of a class.
Makes sense. It's always true of new
Yeah, like
classes.
I don't. Well, I wouldn't say always, because like if you look at Demon Hunter as an example, like Demon Hunter is awesome, right? Like everyone wants to play a Demon Hunter, but in the case of like Monk and Evoker, they've just been a lot less popular, even if their numbers are like
Yeah.
performing really well.
Monk has been like the least played class in the game since it's come out.
yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So, but I feel like people dabbled in Evoker. Like I feel okay. So when I don't have official numbers on this. But like when Legion came out, everyone had a Demon Hunter. There was no one who didn't have like a Demon Hunter alt or something, right? I feel like everyone had a Dragon alt at the beginning of this expansion, and then in the first season they happened to be like super cracked. So if you were a healer and Dragon is this new class, you're gonna play it and like figure it out. And it happened to be super OP. It was also really in depth, and I feel like it took at least in Mythic Plus there was like a lot of ways you could play it. People would have gotten their vision of it there.
The whole like stasis saving up spells and then recap.
Oh,
I remember
that was
there was
cool,
a lot
actually.
of there was a lot of really
insane.
cool stuff you would do. You'd like bank 3
Yeah.
bleed dispels or something by like
Yeah, that was
pressing
big.
it on a target that it wasn't eligible on. That was sick. But
I
yeah,
mean,
I mean,
that
anecdotally,
class is
I could
insane.
back this up because my guild has our main healers. 2 of them had Prez alts and now are not playing Prez alts. They've like swapped to Arsham and Holy Paladin alts because they're like, oh, we don't want to do this. And these are two people who hate logging into the video game and gearing new characters during farm. And they've even bit the bullet and are like doing that so they don't have to keep playing their Prez Evokers in farm.
It's
which
so strange
because
my impression of it is that Preservation Evoker is nowhere near as bad as that situation. Usually when what you just described happens, that class is like horrible. But I don't think Preservation is horrible in Mythic Plus or Raid, but it does seem to be being treated like that. And I mean, in Mythic Plus, I guess it could be, there's
I think it's more that
already
it's
an
horrible
Aug
to
in most
play
groups.
rather than like.
yeah, I
Well,
think
that's also partially.
that during a overhealed farm as well, I think it's really unsatisfying to have that if you're playing that Emerald Blossom build and you have that my only buttons either top somebody or do nothing to them vibe. I think that is particularly unpleasant to play.
The introduction to the class was also like hop based healing through mass echo and reversion spread, and like it's similar to something like a druid or a mistweaver where you're able to just kind of cover everyone with a bunch of little healing, and now it's slowly transitioned into either your health bar is full or empty, right? So it's like where's the
There's no
nuance there
intricacy.
between, like,
Yeah.
Well, and like the people who are
wanna play
attracted
the
to that
hot
idea. Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's the class that I played that class in a few dungeons, and I was like, this is insanely fun. Like the like echoing the like Dream Breath hot, and then you have like reversion, just all these different ways of just pummeling your party with these like little small heals. And that's like kind of there's a bigger healing conversation, probably one we can have on the podcast, where like that's just kind of how all healing used to be a couple expansions ago, and now it's like this entire expansion has been been made famous by the everything just like one shots you or it doesn't kind of thing, and that's like way less fun. And it also makes healing styles like that feel worse because they just don't feel as impactful as they would have been before. But like, yeah, I think Preservation Evoker might be a victim of that more than anything too.
I mean, like, Reversion is such a cool design spell. Like, you can stack crit, it extends the duration, you get more value out of it, you get
Yeah.
longer coverage, you get more interaction with your talents that you invest into reversion duration and increased healing with targets who have reversion. You can stack multiple reversions through Echo. But
Yeah, I
like,
really enjoyed it too in season 1 with just the golden hour 2 being a fun like, oh, this person took a lot of damage, you kind of heal them up instantly and then like set up more healing afterwards.
Golden Hour's cracked, and like it's such a fun thing to play around. Like, oh, my tank got hit from 100% down to 20%. Let me Golden Hour him with an Echo on him, and he's back up. So I think them limiting the playstyles and focusing too heavily on this burst healing playstyle is really what damaged the spec more.
I wonder if like, because I know Prez was intimidating to some people as well, right? Like, particularly if you started playing Dev and then you're like, oh, let me do an off spec heal key. Prez at the start of this expansion, I think, felt a lot more rocket sciencey than some of the more simple healing specs. And I wonder if this is an overreaction from Blizzard to like, let's just change the healing playstyle so you don't have to be doing all that thinking ahead and like doing all these like you press Emerald Blossom and aim it at the people, you press Dream Breath and aim it at the people, and like it heals them, right? But I do wish that there was like, I think it's probably good if that's a valid, viable playstyle, right? And if they're both good, but it seems like they've moved too much towards kneecapping the echo based healing.
Yeah, and we've also moved from like Living Flame as a heal being horrible at the start of the expansion to it's now very strong, and you want to like defensively use Living Flame, which that's good, but
yeah,
why did we have to kneecap everything else along the way to get to this point?
I think we're probably good with Prez. I just think that class feels insanely good to play with that reversion small hot based playstyle, and it just seems like like every class in their spec tree. We actually, Dratnos and I did a bunch of this yesterday on stream, where we like talked to a bunch of classes talking about their tier sets, and they would be like, well, these people want this tier set for this season, and these people want this one because it means you play these totally different builds, and this build is really, really fun, and this build sucks, even though it's strong, whatever. And like that just seems what it is for Prez. It's like Prez has these two different playstyles in their tree, and one of them just sucks, and that happens to be the one that's good right now. And there's a really, really fun one that hasn't been good in a while, and that's just hurting the class more than anything else. And I don't know if it's really on like, well, how does Blizzard solve that? Do they make the fun build better? Do they try to make both builds fun? I don't know how you make. I'm serious. I've seen you play it. I don't know how you make. What is it? Dream Blossom? What's the little green circle that goes on the ground?
Emerald Blossom.
Bro, any build that revolves around Emerald Blossom is bad, and it will always be bad. That is a supplementary button. There is no way, unless that it like becomes a hot or something, but like the whole like shooting everyone's health to full or they're dead thing is just bad. Any healer spec that plays like that is bad.
Like the fact that you're like reliant on getting procs of Emerald Blossom to continue Emerald Blossoming, because like every Emerald Blossom you cast spawns seeds, which have a chance to turn into another Emerald Blossom for free. So it's like totally RNG. You're rolling the dice every time you press the button, whether you do a lot of healing or just whatever the tooltip says.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of move to Dev, unless like maybe you have any like what? Okay, actually, I think this is a good thing to end with all of the specs. What would your change be? You are someone who thinks about Pres a lot. What like you can make a change to preservation that I don't know if it fixes it, but like what would you push them in the direction of taking that class?
I mean, season 1 playstyle was definitely the best of like the 3 tiers that we've been able to play Prez. So I would say push more for hot based gameplay, reversion, echo based gameplay. Unlock the spec tree a little bit more, like add more connections between the points, because right now you're pretty streamlined going left or right, left being Emerald Blossom, right being echo based. And by being able to like branch between the two would be really cool. But yeah, I mean, it comes down to reversion is more fun than Emerald Blossom, and echo is more fun than Emerald Blossom as well. So I would say just lean more into like the kind of Giga Brain playstyle and let that be rewarding, but also keep Emerald Blossom there as like the simple like introductory. You know, you just kind of want to mess around and you play Dev or Aug and you just kind of want to heal for a key or whatever, and let that be an easy space to get into, but reward players for planning ahead and playing off of Echo more.
Cool. So we're gonna spend the most time on Aug, but I want to do Devastation first. I when this spec came out, it was very clear they were making it to be easy. I think it was like the movement range, you're, pretty short range, but infinite movement, and then the rotation is just very clearly. Actually, there was some weird intricacies through the expansion with like clipping Disintegrate or not and stuff like that, but it was very clearly designed to be almost like the no movement Havoc Demon Hunter of just range DPS. But then I think it actually played with a lot of fun. Like it was just I don't know a lot of people who play Devastation are like, I hate this. Like I think it's a really underrated good spec they made as far as design. Like it's pretty fun. I don't know. Like, do any of you guys feel that way who've played it like as an alt or anything?
I played it a lot as an alt in season 1, and yeah, I mean, it was remarkable because it had a very, like, if you look at all the sims, it was the bottom in actions per minute by far, like the fewest clicks you'd need to do. But it did have these weird counterintuitive things with like Disintegrate clipping and I would actually say Azure Striking during Dragon Rage are both things that
I love that.
many people I knew who played Dev casually did not understand or do because it was counterintuitive on both cases. And so they would like these are like people who don't look at guides for their alts or whatever, like more casual friends, and I would see them playing Dev and just doing that entirely wrong because then like that was an interesting thing to me about the spec because I understand where they're coming from, right? It is counterintuitive on both of those parts. But aside from that, I don't know. It was I mostly only played it during season 1, and I thought it was a lot of fun. Like I think it was a really modern spec, and I think it was well targeted at being kind of simpler to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my input out. So, as a person that's played the spec a lot, I fucking love the spec. It is still like by far the most fun I've had playing a spec, and maybe I haven't played like that many things, but in season 1, and I actually think like in season 1. So you mentioned a lot of there was actually a lot of flaws too with the like most of your cooldown reduction happened through spending essence burst, and so like that's where like the clipping Disintegrate thing kind of like came through. You were like more trying to trigger and spend as many essence burst procs to get cooldown reduction on your empowers and like extend Dragon Rage. So that was like the main gameplay with that. But they kind of took that away into season 2, where most of the cooldown reduction now just happens by just like full channeling the spell or spending power. It's like less off essence burst and more like actually doing the spells. And I think that was actually it made it a lot more like even more simple, I guess. Like there's no intricacies of like clipping that. But at the same time, the overall gameplay of it became a ton better, especially in like Mythic Plus. On top of that, I think they buffed the chance that you get burnout. So instead of like Azure Striking now, you're actually like getting instant cast Living Flames, which are I think way more satisfying in my opinion than Azure Striking in Dragon Rage. But also just like the cooldown reduction flows way better. So that way you like you go in an AoE pack and you don't have to spend these weird globals just generating resources. You can just press Pyre and maybe get very lucky with like the bounces, and then it like you get your Fire Breath off cooldown like very fast, and you can get some like ridiculous like extensions of your Dragon Rage just from like what seems like intuitive gameplay. And that like just that movement like in season 2, like I don't know, that spec it became way, in my opinion, like way more fun to play than it was in season 1. And I think I liked it in season 1 too. So I'd be curious if you gave it a shot again and like just see like if you think it got better or worse. But I think it plays a lot like very well right now.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't quit it because I didn't like it or anything. I quit it because I wanted to start playing Aug because it seemed really important to play Aug, which I assume is maybe a story that resonates with a lot of dev evokers out there.
Oh my, yeah. I mean, there was like almost like this Aug requirement that you felt like you needed to have, and if you didn't have that, if you were a Dev Evoker, there were Pres Evokers and Dev Evokers both. Even though it was kind of like a DPS class that like were like, oh, I just have to play this thing now. And maybe there was a lot of people that felt like they wanted to play Dev and Raid. I'm sure at the highest level and a medium level where you were just an Aug really, and it's like you have to make a choice of whether you want to help your team or be selfish. Kind of, it's like the PI argument from a long time ago, you know. And that kind of is always going to feel bad.
Funny
I
thing
should
is-
think too. I think too if they added some of the utility stuff from like Aug, then like even playing Dev would feel even better because like you're being helpful to your team also, and just playing the specialization like Devastation.
One of the funny things about like Dev players swapping to Aug is, for the longest time, Dev was the best Aug target. Like you wanted to buff Dev, and so like you needed a surplus of Evokers, and you needed good Dev players and good Aug players to like be optimal in a raid comp. But you know, with Dev being nerfed this tier, it's sad to see what it used to be and what it is now. I mean, it's still a very good buff target for Aug, which I guess we'll talk about later. But it's sad that they kind of killed the one DPS spec to introduce a new DPS spec instead of letting them both coexist.
I think that's a problem for them to solve in the next expansion. I think they should be able to coexist. I mean, we should actually probably just transition into this. I imagine, like, we have to talk about augmentation. Again, this is something that Maevey like fully went into. Maevey's entire job, for people who are listening, this race, and we needed someone to do this, was to not raid, and they had to like understand every single thing about Aug, and they had to look at logs every pull, which again was like almost impossible because log hooks are just totally borked, and you have to figure out exactly the best ebb and might targets the entire fight, and that constantly changes in a raid. It's this super crazy, really hard thing to do. Not to mention finding ways to get in range of them. That was a bigger problem, right? This tier than like you would expect. Like, oh well, it's easy. Just buff the 4 people. Like, okay, well, where are those 4 people? You know, they're kind of all over the place. And then like figuring that out. So we've had to like science Aug down the tests we did before this patch came out. You know, like just trying to figure out if it's even good or not. I don't know. Just let's dive into it. What are your all's Aug takes?
There's a lot that it is.
There's a lot to cover.
There's a lot. I've always like. I mean, initially it definitely sounded like a cool idea, like, oh, kind of a spec that, you know, does like just buffs friends. And I think like when you take it to a level where, especially when like every like damage can really matter, and then you start to think about, oh shit, there's like a lot of min-maxing that can be done that you would need to do because you know you want to get the most out of the spec. And some of it began to terrify me, like when we started like back in season 2 when we were doing things that involved like having like maps and stuff with like where your DPS are standing, and then just thinking about like trying to implement all that stuff like while you're doing like progression on really hard bosses. Like I was just like terrified. There's just no way that this is gonna like this is just gonna be like hell on earth to figure out. And it's just like, yeah, you definitely need that one person that literally just focuses on analyzing Aug things.
Dude, I mean, go ahead, maybe.
I was just gonna say, like, I would hate to progress as this class without this current 2-piece that allows you to have 4 presences out to decide your targets. It is absurd that Blizzard thinks that picking 2 targets and proximity 2 targets is acceptable.
The fact that the other set bonus is winning the vote as well right now is
It is
so funny.
There's no way. There's no
People
way.
are griefing Augs. I swear people are just griefing Augs.
Like
Well, yesterday
both the tier
it
sets are
was
good. So
yeah, it's just that okay. So I'll give you a little bit of context on this. So we didn't stream any of this, but we had a Friday raid for about like a month or two before the patch came out. We ended up canceling at some point when they made a couple changes to the way presence worked and buffing ebb and might worked. But when you could still put 4 ebb and mites on one target, we were doing 4 Aug practice like off stream, figuring out how, you know, the idea is if we're going to use this in progression, we need to be really good at it. It's really, really complicated. So we have to put our time. Oh my God. We had groups of people. We had the Augs like permanently marked, and like they had their presence targets, but then we needed to proximity every single Ebonmite on exactly the right people. It was, what
we
were your
had chorus that we had people assigned to us. Let's say I had like Fired Up and KSP assigned to me. They had a weak aura that had my Ebonmite's cooldown and like my marker. And so like when my Ebonmite was coming off cooldown, they would blink over to me and they'd be my proximity targets. And then we had like obviously the glow weak aura for the 2 presences, but now it's expanded out into 4 presences. We had like minimap tech where we basically had a large minimap and the Augs were marked in green, and everyone else who was eligible for Ebonmite was a white dot. And if someone wasn't eligible to be proximity, they got removed from the minimap. So then you could see like all the remaining white dots were like eligible targets, and you could position yourself on the minimap according to like where you would get 2 proximity targets. We tested all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and
It was a nightmare.
It was so broken that you had to do this. Like it was the potential gain from this was massive, but it turned every single fight into like there's this extra mini game happening with an immense amount of power behind it. And it was just unbelievably cringe. We were so happy when we stopped having these raids. Mainly Ebonmites going from 4 to 2 massively changed it. And then also a few other things made. Oh, the new tier set being announced was like, oh, okay, so we can just most of the time not have any proximity. I think that has to be gone forever. And I have a little bit of an opinion on Aug. I actually think that it's not a surprise that if you talk to Aug players, they actually like playing it in dungeons. Like it's a fun dungeon spec. But when you get into raid, that's where really all the problems come in. And I think that's where Blizzard's design is a little off. So like playing with a weak aura that's just making certain frames glow and you like aren't tracking the cooldowns on your own, and it's just like playing whack-a-mole with presences and like making sure the right people are buffed, that's fun up to an extent, but it's also just like significantly less fun than playing in a dungeon. It's fun initially to like super min-max it, but really how many guilds outside of us and a couple other guilds are gonna have a lot of fun figuring that out? Like probably not a lot. I feel like a lot of people is just like just buff your 4 best players and just hope that's good enough. But the issue is the optimization level from just buff your 4 best players to buff exactly the 4 best DPS in every Ebonmite window is massive, and that is why this class will never be able to be tuned properly. And I think this is what they need to aim to fix. You need to like pick 4 people before the poll somehow, and those are just the people that you're buffing. Then you just create a Mythic Plus environment basically, and I don't know how you do that, but that is the reason why you talk about tuning this class, right? For it not to be, this class is not tuned for the higher end of the game. They created a support class clearly for not the super high end player. That is their target audience. For it to be okay for them to buff the same 4 people, you cannot be able to min-max it as much as you can right now. And that min-maxing makes it unable to be balanced, because if it's only okay for that, it's going to be terrible for the people it's designed for. If it's good for those people, it'll be OP for us. It makes the gameplay worse by not being able to select 4 people, and it also makes it unable to be balanced. I think they just need to like simplify Aug and Raid by a ton, and I think it will solve a ton of the issues that already exist with Aug, especially its tunability. I don't know. What do you guys have any thoughts like that? Like going forward, like how is this a class that isn't just a 2 of in Raid for the rest of existence of WoW if they don't do something like this?
Or 0, even if it's like that bad.
Yeah, I have some interesting thoughts, but I'll let anyone go first
Go ahead. Interesting thoughts are what we're here for.
Yeah. So I actually think Aug's role in Mythic Plus, kind of like right now, is actually in a good spot in the form that it's not like it. So it takes up a DPS slot, obviously, for your dungeon comp, right? Like, there's no way you would like drop a healer or tank like if you had an Aug, because it's a unique like support role. But it's like in a dungeon setting, like it's a little, it could be like a little less damage, or at least I would hope that it is like less damage. But the fact that it buffs your tank and healer kind of just like strengthens like those 4 people a lot, and sometimes they're going to feel good, especially if you're the healer getting buffed. But in Raid, it goes from like that support role to like just being a DPS that kind of does its damage through buffing 4 other damage. And it would almost be interesting if they limited the amount of like kind of forced you to buff, instead of like 4 DPS, you're buffing like 2 DPS, a healer, and or like 2 DPS, 2 healers, and a tank, like at all times. Like that is what your class does. And it would fall in the same role of like, obviously it's not going to compete with real damage dealers, but at the same time you're buffing like your actual healers, like you're actually fitting more of a support role to like like your healers are getting buffed and your tanks are like getting buffed in more impactful ways than it does now. And then like maybe you could actually justify the class based on those parts rather than just raw DPS. Because I think buffing on DPS is like, I mean, it's just numerically like, is it the best DPS or not? Because I think like the off rolls that the class or the spec does is like, I think it could be way more impactful, and then it's like easier to like justify it that way, I think.
Ooh,
Yeah,
I
you would
would
just
say that
have to
that's
make
a
sure the
really
damage is
hot
low.
take.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
in the
because
M plus situation, people are advocating for the reverse, right, Dorky?
right, exactly. Like a lot of people are very upset with Augs specifically because they bring that much defensive value. It's like, oh man. So the fact that you have this one singular spec in the game that's capable of making tanks and healers powerful, unlike any other spec, just makes it so oppressive and people absolutely hate it. There are a lot of people advocating for like making it so that they don't increase main stat anymore, and all they do is just like increase flat damage. So like tanks and healers only get a flat damage increase. But
Yeah. I don't think they'll ever do that.
I agree. Like I personally enjoy playing with an AUG, so I'm an AUG enjoyer, which you know like a lot of people are gonna be upset about.
I think
And
that
like
yeah, go on.
you got it.
Okay, so yeah, I think like in a strict 5-man setting, it could definitely be like, it's just a weird role to like fit for sure. But I do think like in a bigger size group, like it definitely like would be an interesting spot to fill.
I
Like,
think that the
as an
balance
AUG.
they've landed on it right now, where it's like it's kind of nerfed enough that it's not obvious that you should play it in dungeons. Like it's sort of filling this role of do you want to be a little bit slower and a little bit safer?
Okay, that's another thing we need to talk about too. Well, so hold on. I'm need to call out Max real quick here. People have been talking about this video. Max said AUG is specifically 7 to 12% worse than having a third DPS. Do we actually know the numbers or like do we?
No, I was on I remember saying the only thing I've ever referenced with, I mean, what I've been saying recently is everyone keeps saying how much damage you lose by bringing an AUG. And then
Right.
I'm like, has anyone actually proved this? Because going into this raid, we had to spend an insane amount of time doing sample, because logs were broken, doing sample size raid DPS composition, like DPS against each other to figure out how good 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 AUGs were compared against each other. And we had to know, so we did know, and we found out exactly how good AUGs were in raid. I don't know if anyone has
For raid,
done.
yeah.
I don't know if anyone has done that for Mythic Plus. I was just talking about it in my stream one day. I was like, guys, how much is it? And then James just piped up and goes, I don't know. It's like
Goddamn, James.
it's like 7 to 12%. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
okay.
I mean,
yeah.
that's got to be he's got to have done the science, right?
All right,
yeah.
second baby. Do you guys have any thoughts?
I mean, yeah, go on, maybe.
I think 7 to 12% behind running 3 DPS sounds about right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's easy to take similar pulls with, like, okay, you have like a standard group comp of 4 people, like, you know, let's just say hypothetically mage, demon hunter, tank healer, whatever, and it's the same 4 people, same exact pull, same key level, same everything. You just play an AUG, and your AUG player also has to be really good at some other spec that would fit into that comp as well. And then you just play it again, and you just compare the numbers and you see how fast the pool dies. But it's so hard because, like, what if a caster, you know, doesn't get kicked in or something? So it's like you have to do it on like training dummies.
You have to
or
do it in
something.
sample size. No, you don't do it on training dummies. What you have to
Just do
do
it a
is
lot.
you have to do it. Okay, MDI is coming soon. If anyone wants to test this, sign up for the MDI. Don't intend to compete, and literally just do the same pull at the beginning of a dungeon and just
100
do it.
times.
Just do it 50 times, one with an AUG and then one replacing an AUG. And
Yeah,
it
you
doesn't
see
even
which
have
one's
to be the same
faster.
player. It can just be like, you know, whatever the next best class you think would be at that pull, and you will get decently consistent. Do a dungeon where there's like a big AoE pull and then a boss, and just do that over and over again, only one lust, and you will get some kind of a answer. But really, it's going to depend on the group, right? Because like some players are better than others. But the thing is like Sang, and maybe you were a part of this, the amount of work we did before this patch to know exactly how many AUGs were good and why was a lot. And
Yeah.
it's just there isn't a testing environment to do that for Mythic Plus. Like we were positive how good AUG was, but I don't know if anyone is positive how much damage AUG does.
Especially in a dungeon, it's like hard to, because like if you take like the first like if your first pull of a dungeon is like a massive pull and you have two classes like Havoc, Demon Warlock or something, and you have an Aug.
Yeah, like
Like-
2-minute specs too.
Yeah, like sometimes like Aug probably could be like in that moment like it's probably more damage than like if you added like some class that does it like a rogue.
Yeah, if
that's the
number
target
1
map.
and 2 at that damage type are so much more ahead of 3, Aug will always beat that third DPS because
Yeah.
those two things are so specifically good at that. So you'd need like a larger sample
But
size.
I think a dungeon like that, like the it can shift, right? Like the rogue will pop off on smaller target pulls, but and then when it's like the value of Aug and Raid came from like buffing 4 people that excelled at a certain situation at any time and being able to shift that. Where in a dungeon, like you're just buffing the same people at all times. So like if you have DPS that are sandbagging like at certain parts of the dungeon, it loses value that way.
Also,
Yeah, not only that,
deaths,
deaths,
mid-key
yeah, it
deaths.
also just amplifies what your group is good at, but it also like it shows the glaring weaknesses. Like say if you're playing 2 very high burst 2-minute specs, but outside of the 2-minute windows, you are like completely useless because your third DPS, which is an Aug, is also really not doing a whole lot for that situation.
I also think just going back to Aug in general, like everyone keeps talking about like, oh, they have all these defensive tools that no one else has. The only way that has ever made sense is if you take a hit in the damage that they're bringing to the group for all of that, for all of those tools to exist. The issue with Aug so far is that they just haven't. Like right now, top groups are experimenting with this, like, oh, we can do faster keys without an Aug, and you can try that. But no one actually really knows, right? And in 10.1.5, it was absolutely a DPS increase to bring an Aug, and then they also made your dungeon way easier regardless of that, right? There needs to be an interesting decision of like, do we take a damage loss to have a safer run, or do we, play a little riskier with a little bit less healing, tanks are a little bit less powerful? Like, do we try to go for, what I'm saying? Like, that is interesting. The thing is, it's never really quite been that.
I mean, even if you look now at the top of the leaderboards as well, like, I know that's not a great metric because sometimes people do dumb stuff, but like, you'd think if no Aug was like a lot faster, I guess just this season speed isn't that important because the timers are so lenient, but like,
Yeah.
39 of the top 40 runs, I think, are still running an Aug. So it definitely still seems, if it's not the best, it's at least the easiest enough and good enough that it,
Yeah, I
is
think
basically best.
based on my experience, like most of the dungeons aren't timers,
Mhm.
but like I think if you start like maybe to push that one extra key level, that's when like the timer might be relevant in some cases, and like a group that can risk like playing no Aug, get that little bit of extra DPS, can actually overcome that timer. Like that's like it's almost a difference of like a single possible key level, like potentially. Whereas you can go on.
I was gonna say real quick, it's actually like it's a catch-22 because on one hand it's like all right, so you can do this higher level by having more damage, but by having more damage, you're suddenly forsaking so much defensive value, and then it just becomes significantly harder to actually do that key because like what if your tank is just getting absolutely destroyed, or what if like you just don't have the healing throughput to survive, or what if you just don't have the defensives to live?
There's also
mean-
things like target swapping, like on second boss of Waycross Manor, there's spikes. If you are playing with an Aug and your non-Aug DPS gets spiked, that spike is taking forever to die. If your
Yeah.
Aug gets spiked, the spike dies instantly because their buffs are still active while they're stunned. But if the non-Aug DPS is stunned, their DPS is not active and the Aug's DPS isn't active from them. So it's like you double down on like being good at doing something, but then you're worse at something else, which is like target swapping or like being CC'd, or if someone dies, then you just completely lose like 1.5 people in a pool.
Yeah. Going forward, I just don't know how exactly to deal with it. It makes sense that the community sentiment has kind of grown against it. I think this has happened in previous expansions too, where some class is just always in, and it seems like unfair that they're in, but it's never been to this level because there's just never been a class in the history of WoW that, if they're doing top tier damage, they don't also have this much utility. They have more utility than like every class. Also, something you guys failed to mention, like 39 of the top 40 runs. There's also certain affixes where not bringing an Aug is ridiculous. You know, like
Yeah.
Afflicted.
Yeah,
Uh,
or
Aug solos
raging.
afflicted so easily.
raging.
Raging,
Yeah,
you just got a pressing roar, yeah.
yeah. There's just one class in the game with an AoE soothe, so that's good.
What was it, 2 weeks ago? Afflicted Raging Week, where it was literally bring an
Yeah,
Aug and the
that
key
was
is
great.
just affixless. Like the Aug actually solos every Afflicted. If you don't solo it as an Aug, you're trolling. Raging, I mean, you just press suppressive roar and it resets itself. Like I don't know, it's free.
Yeah, it's insane, for sure.
Yeah, I talked with Karasis. He did a little bit of log analysis with like Aug versus no Aug keys, and there's like not a whole lot of data because not a lot of people have been doing this at high end. But the no Aug groups have noticeably more deaths, which I've noticed when I watch James's stream. They happen to die a lot. For maybe it's an Aug thing, maybe it's not.
Maybe it's
But
James thing, it's
yeah,
who's to
it could
say?
be. But like, despite all those deaths, they are actually having similar timers, if not better, than the groups with no Aug. So like it comes at a cost. You generally sacrifice a lot of safety, but you will make up time.
Yeah, I think their strat has been run tanky classes and drop Aug. I still think
Yeah.
like the thing is though is you're comparing double mage, but like I think double mage is a bad cook. So
Yeah.
like you're having
Yeah,
to
you think
compare
so?
like yeah, I think it's a bad cook.
What's the good cook?
I don't know what the good cook. I haven't really. I mean, it's like tanky classes and like Havoc is in
Yeah.
certain high tyrannical keys is actually like kind of not tanky. They actually like run out of stuff where those
Warlock,
classes
maybe.
don't. Yeah, like maybe it's Warlock. I don't know.
I think Warlock is pretty good. Yeah.
Warlock is unkillable.
Sometimes they
and,
troll your key half the time with their fucking imps, but
That's true.
wait, what did you want me to answer? Maybe.
He wants
Uh,
permission to talk about healing Aug tech build, healing build Aug.
Is the world ready to know?
Yeah, is this hidden lore or is this discussable? This is like what, 2 talents you swap to make this happen?
Yeah, but I mean, it we tested it in Avarice a lot.
Yeah, you
Okay.
can talk about it.
Okay. Oh, I mean, we can finish this Mythic Plus stuff and then we'll loop
We can
back
cut
around
this
to
out
that.
if you want to make it secret, by the way.
What is the Mythic? I mean, like, what is there even really to talk about in Mythic Plus? This gets talked about every day on everyone's stream. It's like this very big oppressive thing that exists. I mean, I just think there's only one solution. If you're gonna do the like super Aug support thing, and they're not gonna. By the way, everyone keeps saying this. They're not gonna delete the spec. It's just simply not happening. You can hope that they maybe go more in a direction that is less support based. But I think if you want to get a glimpse into the future, you can look at a lot of their what are they called? Hero talents, hero classes, something like that. Like the Aug one is the one that we've seen is pretty supporty, right? So like I don't know if they're going in a completely opposite direction with that. If they're going to have an insane amount of support, they need to come at a clear and obvious damage loss. That's the only thing that can possibly be balanced, and then it's a choice, right? Maybe it'll dominate the lower keys where there's no timer really, it's just staying alive, but at the higher keys there needs to be a clear damage loss to run this, or else the game makes no sense. So it just has to happen. And then maybe this is something else that's like Aug related. Maybe you can go into this, but also like logs being broken are a huge problem. I can't believe this is still a thing. Where, and maybe there's something to do with this. Okay, so like the brainchild behind Aug was like not the brainchild, like the person who made it. Graham Berger was his name. He's a dev. He did a lot of interviews at the beginning of the expansion. Seemed pretty smart. He left the company like right at the beginning of 10.2 or something, or right before it. And it was also when log hooks were broken, and he was the one doing all of that. So like they've just kind of been broken ever since. And like that's another thing where like how can anyone tell if this class is good? Also, I believe they made an actual decision from the interviews that they've said. It sounds like they've made a decision that details will not show Aug's contributions, but logs will. And it doesn't sound like a tech issue. The way that they answered it, I could be wrong. It just really sounds like this, that they intentionally did it on details. And I think that's a big mistake. Like, I think if you guys talk about the impact that Aug has, yeah, it's like it's meta, it has a bunch of utility. I think the whole like details meters don't matter in raid anymore at all. If there's an Aug in your raid, like you just have no idea how much damage you're doing. And then also, oh well, it's okay, you can just look at logs. Those are also completely wrong. Like that, I feel like that must have had a really negative impact. And it's not just parse lords or whatever. It's like you can play this game and not be a parse goblin and just be like, okay, I don't know. I just like popped all my cooldowns and I felt like I did really well. I want to look over. Oh, am I doing a lot? No idea. I have no clue. And that really sucks. I don't know if healers feel that, but as DPS, it really, really sucks.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about log stuff first, or? Just
Yeah. Slam the healing Aug thing.
Okay, so this is piggybacking off what Sang said a little bit ago when you're still talking about like how to fix it for raid. We're like buffing 2 healers, 2 DPS, tank, whatever. So obviously the healing stuff in the talent tree for Aug, it like increases healing done, and you're able to spend essence on Emerald Blossom. We did testing this in Nabrus, and it turns out you're like just half a healer when you start doing this kind of stuff, because you're amping your healers by 6%, you're keeping that 6% healing buff active, you're Emerald Blossoming whenever it's needed, and you're just DPSing outside of that. So you're able to, like, you could ebb and bite your healers as well to provide more impact, but without ebb and biting healers, and you're still ebb and biting DPS, you can provide enough throughput in healing windows to just basically be a healing cooldown that walks around and also as a DPS. And this is like goes back to kind of like the mop kind of cooldown, where like you would have boomkins like tranking or whatever, and like, you know, your LA shamans would use like healing type totem. You can have a support playstyle without it being the most broken DPS spec in the game. If that's what Blizzard wants, is a support, then they can double down and they can allow you to play something that is like a hybrid. That it's not a true damage dealer, it's not a true healer, but you're able to provide tools to your group and provide throughput in multiple different ways, whether it's damage or healing. And they just have to like tune around that aspect of like, you know, in raid you're gonna be really good, but in Mythic Plus, you know, you might want to increase the personal damage of the Aug instead of doing like buff stuff, because like in arena you also have Augs doing nearly full damage and the buffs are inconsequential. No Augs in arena stack mastery at all. Meanwhile, mastery is the best stat in PvE. So like Blizzard has the tools to make personal damage be more of a like an overall damage share for Augs. They could do that in Mythic Plus while also still keeping a like support gameplay in Mythic Plus as well, and then also in raid you're still buffing, you know, DPS, but you can provide healing support as well. And it's just like an avenue that they can explore more deeply that isn't just true damage dealer. And if they want a support play style, which it seems like they keep saying, oh, is it support, but like it's not a support, it's a damage dealer right now, and that's like the polarizing aspect of it, I think.
Interesting, Cook. So just make it like literally 0.5 of a DPS and 0.5 of a healer.
Yeah, or I mean, you could change those ratios.
Yeah, or let you talent
0.7
between like
DPS,
0.7 and 0.3 in either
Yeah.
one.
I mean,
yeah.
So that already kind of exists, like he was saying, if you want to do that. Because a lot of people are going to look at it as like, oh, you play these talents, you lose some DPS, but you just start pressing Emerald Blossom the whole pull. No, you're not. You're pressing it in moments where you actually need to not die, and then you're DPSing the other. Like, so for example, in P1 of Sarkareth, maybe you throw 2 out when you do the massive raid clear. Maybe you throw 1 out when the bombs are exploding. And it's high value. It's like high value GCDs spent on healing that are also, you know, not going to lose you a ton of damage. Where when people look at that build now, they like look at how much DPS you lose if you play those talents and then you just press Emerald Blossom instead of Eruption or whatever your spam is. And then like you're just looking at it the wrong way, right? But yeah, there's classes all kinds of viability, but you know, I think we've talked it out. Aug. We definitely need to see like kind of where they're going with that. I hope Blizzard realizes that it's like it's also just like it in this place. Like they kind of need like a PR break from it. Like they probably need to make Aug like pretty bad in season 4 or like the beginning of next expansion, because like there's like a rampaging mob that is not going to be silenced until they're just not good for a little bit, and they can come back later and deal with that and recook it for next expansion or something. But I think that's important. There was one thing. Oh, I kind of wanted to add another thing about this is just Evokers in general, but kind of like a greater game philosophy. So empowered spells got added this expansion to Evoker, and it was like this kind of very unique thing. And initially I was like pretty down on it. I was like, I just feel like these aren't nearly as interesting as they could be. But then a lot of them actually feel pretty good. So I guess before asking any other questions, like, how do you guys feel about in general just playing a class with Empower? Do you think Empower is good? Do you think Empower is like well made?
Does it have a whole charging up abilities? Or
Yeah.
I think they're boring personally, at least from like a Prez Aug perspective. Prez, it's pretty like Spirit Bloom, you casting at max ranks. Fire Breath, you want to cast at max ranks for Leaping Flames, and Dream Breath, there's some nuance there whether you cast 1, 2, 3, or 4, but you know, in raids it's typically at 1, in Mythic Plus it's typically at 3 or 4. So like you're not really deciding moment to moment what you're casting at. You're just casting the ability and you're just waiting for a longer cast time.
Yeah, that's interesting because I actually think so there's definitely a case of like, oh, you just always cast it like rank 1 or max rank. And there's very few empowers that like you actually whatever like that changes or it's very situational. I actually think Devastation could have it best, where Fire Breath is a very interesting, like often you cast it at rank 1, but sometimes based on like how fast the target's gonna die, you cast it like higher rank just to get more of the damage up front. Like in your cooldowns, you like cast the second one at max rank, and there's like a lot more like it's just like the idea of like you can do more of your damage up front is like sometimes like that is a choice you make sometimes what you're fighting along with its mastery. And then like Eternity Surge just being like, I mean, Eternity Surge is kind of basic, just like, you know, more ranks, more targets hit. But I like, yeah, for like augmentation, I know it's like just like you always rank 1 upheaval unless you need to hit another target.
I've been doing some keys on Aug, and I find that sometimes I'm holding my upheaval just a little bit longer than I need to. Like even though I'm covering the entire pack, there's a caster that's about to come off cooldown, and I'm mid cast, and I'm like, I want to knock that up as soon as it starts casting. So I'm going to channel like 0.3 seconds longer just to make sure that I interrupt that cast as well.
Yeah, I think that's a little interesting too. Like, cause I do the exact same thing. Yeah, like sometimes you'll know something's about to cast, and you just start charging up the upheaval, and you're just waiting for that cast, and then you let it loose, which I think is interesting.
So I have a question for people who have played Evoker and play other things. Do you guys think empowered spells have any use in any other classes as well? Is there a scenario where you could see another spec in the game not becoming fully based around empowers, but just having an empower added and having that benefit the class in some way? Or have you thought about that at all?
I will say, with empowers though, they would have to fix like, or at least like they are very buggy in terms of like responsiveness sometimes, and just the weird like at least for Evoker ones, like if you ever cancel like an empower, it globals you as well, and it's just like sometimes with like high latency, like it just won't cast, and you just get globaled anyways, and it's like the worst spell to ever like fail casting. Like, like if you ever fail casting an empower after you started, it is the absolute worst feeling. And I think like it might like I think a lot of people get very annoyed with those if they were like in other classes.
I had a few like conceptual ideas of spells that would maybe be cool as empowers, but I actually think that if I said any of them, the people who played that class would be mad at me for suggesting that they got an empower, which I think maybe goes to show that there's still some work they need to do on.
The idea is good, but I think the gameplay of it sometimes really like just awful consequences, I think.
Yeah.
I agree with you, Dratnos. I think there's like a spell you could take. Like I think everyone thinks of it like I remember someone mentioned this about Hunter at some point. They're just like make aimed shot and empower, right? It's like you're drawing your bow and then every hunter in existence just goes fucking wild. Like they don't want that.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, well, of course, having an empower that you press, like imagining pressing an empower in your rotation as often as you press aimed shot is ridiculous. Even evokers don't have that, right? Like that's a crazy thing. But it's like, I don't know, like having something charge up and then depending on how long you charge it, it does something completely different. That concept, if done right, would be cool for pretty much everyone, if not used frequently. It's just about how they would implement it. I don't think they necessarily would. I don't think they've said in interviews that they plan on doing that, but it's definitely a cool concept. That being said, I don't know if Evoker totally nailed that, right? Like, I think Devastation's version of this is super lame, right? Like was it Eternity Surge where you hold it and just hits more targets? That nothing could be more basic than that. You know, I think empowers, if done right, are just like super cool. Like I don't know. I'd give some examples, but just like Dratnos said, I'm not trying to be on the radar of any.
Yeah, I have.
of
I
any class.
literally have some classes that I think it would, but they would hate me. Any of them would hate me.
What is it?
I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm not falling
Yeah,
for
he's,
that.
he's not
Oh.
saying it for that exact
If I
reason.
speak, I'm in big
Oh
trouble.
my god.
Like Frank can just bleep it out. It'll be fun.
No, he will. He will not do that, man. He hates me.
Crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, like, think about. Well, okay. I'll do aim shot for a second, but
Why
it
is that
can't.
so
It can't
diplomatic?
like be like. Let's just imagine aim shot as an empower ability. If you tap it, it just shoots off instantly. Only does single target, just like it did in HFC with that tier bonus. But then if you hold it as an empower for just as long as the cast is now, it like gains a little bit more damage. So like you have to make a choice whether you want to aim shot on the move or you can aim shot on single like on single target and you can stand still. It's like the old idea with mastery where like you stand still and do more damage. Like there's some benefit to actually casting it, and that can depend on the situation. It'd be hard to work that in rotationally. And then like if you want to giga hold it and you can only do this once every like 20 seconds or something, you actually AoE aimed shot and it like serpent stings everything or something, kind of like old survival hunter multi-shot AoE. And then like you can't, it would be boring if that didn't have a cooldown on it, because then you would just be holding aimed shot as all of your damage all the time, and that's like super annoying. But like you're talking about different dimensions to spells as an example. I'm not saying they should do this. Hunters, fucking relax, don't like go all crazy, but like that just shows you that there is some way to make stuff like that cool and not just the base level that Evokers have right now, where you could just have different decisions with the same button.
Yeah, I guess since you've been brave and you've done one, I'll do one. Icefury could buff more or less frost shocks, and if it buffs less of them, they do more damage or something. And so you're choosing between like getting more or less movement globals out of it versus just making it like fewer, less rotational impact, something like that.
I can't believe you chose
people already
Icefury.
hate Icefury, so
Yeah, exactly.
it's safe,
so
right?
funny. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if they hate Icefury and they don't want to play it, making it empower, they're going to avoid it anyway.
They already hate it. If you hate clunkiness, you already hate Icefury. So
no, but stuff like that is actually interesting. But it's funny because like you chose Icefury, which is like this extremely polarizing. Like,
well, yeah, I
people
didn't
hate
want
her,
to choose like Void Eruption or something that somebody loves, which could be an interesting
or
power
fucking
spell,
aim
but
shot.
Yeah,
they like. Yeah, I mean, you have that actually would make sense. Like if you just wanted to get one and it was super powerful, or if you wanted to like go on the move, you could get 5. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's good. It exists. I don't know if Blizzard will do this, and man, if they ever did this and it didn't work,
yeah,
would people be?
They would have
oh
to.
My god,
They would
It would have to be a
1000%
banger.
have to fix all the bugs around empower spells before they ever move.
And it would have to be a banger. It would have to be
Yeah.
extremely good to have anyone else be open to this existing. Because if they ever tried on another class and it was even mediocre, it would just be the most reviled thing. Like you could not do it. All right, I think we're chilling. I just did want to come back to one thing. So I forgot to ask this earlier, and maybe Frank can splice this in the recording of this.
He will never do that. He's lazy.
Yeah. Saying if there's one thing you could change about Dev Evoker, what would it be? Or if not change, but like if you could push them in a direction that they're not going in now, where would that be?
It's a tough one because I already like the spec a lot, except that's new tier set I don't like, but I did kind of like the I liked the idea of its mastery being like, oh, you kind of like hit targets higher health, but obviously it's balanced around that, and then it's just like reverse execute is never.
Yeah, we didn't talk
really
about that because
fun.
that was like a saga. This expansion, they nerfed the impactfulness of mastery as well. Right?
Yeah, it was pretty like, I think it was heavily directed at like, yeah, Dragon Rage, like wanted to move damage out of that, which they ended up probably doing the opposite with the new tier set, but we won't talk about that. This new tier set isn't good. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's like it's kind of like a very basic damage dealer. If they like, if it just doesn't have at least a little bit of that mastery, which I guess it kind of does. Like like the mastery still exists. You do a little bit of bonus damage to high health targets. So it's hard for me to like say like what's wrong with it, because I like if anything, like there's like why the 25 yards, right? Like why does it exist? And like there's no logical like reason other than just like, cosmetic, like, you kind of limited, but it does have that mobility to cover it. So like maybe that's like why. Um, I don't know. I think I think it just needs like a couple more buttons, like maybe one or two more buttons to just press that are like not too disruptive with the flow of it right now, but like maybe like a it's hard to explain. I really have nothing exactly I can say, but I think it just needs like one or two more buttons. That's it. That's all I can say really.
Okay, that's good. And then I guess we kind of asked about the changes to Aug too, right? Like we kind
Yeah.
of went over that a lot.
That was more there's obviously a lot more like cooks that people have about that, but I do think that was kind of one of the big things we were talking about.
All right, cool. So I think we're chilling, right?
Yeah,
Can we
I
talk
think
about logs?
logs. Yeah. We talked about that a little bit, I guess, but do you have anything to add on the Aug log situation?
I hate incorrect data sets, and the fact that this class or the spec was released with non-functioning logs and they still
Yeah.
don't work is a little bit disappointing. And I think it
It's insane.
warps the community perception of like people think they're either too good or too bad. Like, oh, the logs are lying, they're the best thing ever, but like they might just be barely the best, or like, they're middle of the pack in Mythic Plus, or they're actually bottom of the pack in Mythic Plus, or whatever it is. The fact that we still have spells that aren't hooked at all, like Ragefire, Soul Scar, I don't know, I could probably mention more, but those are like the two that are on the top of my head that are like massive, massive issues. The fact that things don't attribute damage properly, like the actual damage share coming from Ebb and Might, Shifting Sands, and Prescience just are wrong on logs. And this is not a Warcraft logs issue, this is a Blizzard issue. Just to be clear with everyone. There's so much wrong that needs to be fixed, and I really hope that before the next expansion, it can be accurate and we can actually trust what's in logs and not have to rely on going to a spreadsheet, testing with 14 DPS on a dummy, taking out 2 DPS, putting in 2 Augs, and then looking at the overall DPS numbers and seeing whether or not like Aug is good or bad, because that's what you have to do.
That's what we did.
What we
so many
did,
times.
and so yeah, like pulling dummies like over and over with like the same talents and same gear, and just comparing like, okay, now all of a sudden we're doing 100k more raid DPS because we took out 2 people and we added 2 DPS that logs are saying
It was
are
well more
less
than 100k
DPS.
as well.
Yeah,
It's insane.
I didn't know the exact number, but it's significant amount of DPS more. And the fact that you have to do that to actually determine what an Aug is worth in terms of value is absurd.
I also think so in Dungeons it's its own thing, but in raids, like no one knows how exactly good any classes are. Like I remember Windwalker got buffed, and I was like, I wonder how much Windwalker is going to go up the meter, like go up on like overall rankings or like specific bosses. But then you look, and even after Windwalkers got buffed, how many Windwalkers in guilds do you think were getting Aug buffed? I don't know, probably 0, right? So the classes that they're like creeping up on near the top, the Warlocks, the Demon Hunters, the Rogues, the Hunters, all those people, those classes get Auged all the time, right? So those classes on like overall Warcraft logs numbers, if you look at like, over the whole raid or you pick specific bosses that are a little bit more accurate, the top classes are actually higher on the list because they're getting Auged and then they're not attributing all their damage back to the Augs. So like the entire spec balance of this game is completely inaccurate as well. Like classes that are getting Auged just look better than they are, and
like rogues.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
rogues are also rogues are super insane, but you are right. Like rogues are doing that.
It's just
like,
impossible to know. And every further season from here, we're gonna have less of like an accurate baseline in our heads, and it's more and more gonna be just warped by, the.
What's crazy is they almost had it right at one point.
Yeah, it was like really, really good in 10.5. Yeah.
10.17, I think, is like where they had like very clear good log. There was just some things that weren't hooked. But then we went into 10.2 PTR, and all of a sudden attributions on logs were like 33% of what they were on live. So it's like the same spell that was contributing, let's say 8k DPS or 9k DPS, just for easy numbers, is now contributing only 3k DPS. But the spells themselves haven't changed at all. So it's like, what number can we trust here? Like, are the original numbers correct? Are the new numbers correct? no one knows, right? And
Well,
like,
we looked at it on.
we have
I
to
mean,
look at
the,
overall
the,
DPS. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. The old number, the overall DPS would lend you to believe that the old numbers were correct and Augs were significantly overperforming their damage on logs. Yeah, I mean that's obviously true. I mean, I can give you all the testing environment we did. It was, like we would basically run an entire raid comp of the best classes. Pretty close to what we ran in progression. The comp didn't change for a while beforehand. We would swap out 2 Augs and bring 2 other good classes like a Demon Hunter or a Hunter or a Rogue or something that was actually really competitive. We would not bring in random specs. And then we would bring in Augs, and the Augs number 1 and 2 were like the highest DPS at the time was Assassination Rogue before the final nerf they got before the raid came out, and Augmentation number 1 and 2 were doing like something like 40 and 50k more single target effective DPS than the literal best single target class in the game. And that's just, I mean, that's insane. Like that's like untouchably insane. And even your 3rd and 4th Aug buffing less the 5th through 8th most valuable person in every ebb and might window, which we also tested. Those were like upper middle of the pack, and still Aug Evokers with cheat deaths and really sick utility, right? So like I don't know, it's
Yeah, I think for the longest time, it was Aug 1 and 2 were like significantly ahead of number 1, and Augs 3 and 4 were still top. But
Oh yeah.
not as top.
Oh, perfect. I'm glad you brought this up. Yeah, until the last Aug nerf before progression, Augs 3 and 4 were still higher than the number 1 DPS that was not an Aug. And so that last nerf they did for before progression was saving us from an even worse hell of you were playing 4 Augs on everything no matter what. They were super broken. So yeah. Woohoo! Evoker. All right, it's been a good episode. Bring us out, Dratty.
All right, that's it. That's the end of our Evoker episode. I'm sure we'll be referencing this one for many years to come, as these topics will probably continue to matter. So maybe revisit them in a future. But thanks so much for coming on the old PoddyC, Sang and Maevey. That was really great to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
See everybody whenever we decide we're going to do a podcast again.
Woohoo!
Woohoo!
Hell yeah.
Woohoo!
Yep.
Yeah.